All right. Introduction to Dr. Wortle's School, Volume 1, Chapters 1 to 12. Quote, the Reverend Geoffrey Wortle, D.D., Doctor of Divinity, was a man much esteemed by others and by himself. End of quote. And so our story begins with another pugnacious clergyman as the central character. A collection of quotes. He was an affectionate tyrant, a man who would bear censure from no human being. He had not only disliked, but openly ridiculed all signs of a special pietistic bearing. It was said of him that he had been heard to swear. End of quotes. When we meet him, Dr. Wortle is well established and respected as rector of Bowick Parish and schoolmaster of Bowick School, although not without making some enemies in the process. He had triumphed over any interference from 3 successive bishops and had taken to law the Honorable Mrs. Stantiloup over disputed charges for her son's residence at the school. Dr. Wortle's small family consists of his wife, quote, she had good health, easy temper, pleasant friends, abundant means, and no ambition. She went nowhere without the doctor and his very pretty 16-year-old daughter. It's interesting that the narrator tells us simply that she, the daughter, takes after her father, then gives us 2 pages of physical description of him. Luckily, she has also, quote, inherited her mother's peculiar softness and complexion. Bowick School has been a great success, and Dr. Wortle needs more employees. He makes a plan to hire a multi-purpose married couple to help him out. The husband will be both classics instructor and curate for Bowick Parish. The wife will be housekeeper and matron to the boys in residence. Through his connections at Oxford, Dr. Wortle finally finds what appears to be the ideal couple, Mr. and Mrs. Peacock. At first, they seem the perfect fit. Dr. Wortle and Mr. Peacock become great friends, and Mrs. Peacock is more than up to the tasks assigned to her. But something is a bit off. They refuse to engage in any social life in the community. What does Mr. Peacock mean when he says, quote, we are not like any other decent people, end quote? Our narrator tells us, quote, it is my purpose to disclose the mystery at once and to ask you to look for your interest, should you choose to go on with my chronicle, simply in the conduct of my persons during this disclosure to others, end of quote. The narrator then goes on to tell a truly terrible tale of passionate love surrounded by abuse, treachery, and betrayal, a novel in itself. The villains of this saga are the handsome Lefroy brothers, Ferdinand and Robert, raised like gentlemen on a slave plantation in Louisiana. While they were still in their teens, their father lost everything in the Civil War. After this, they felt, quote, that the world had nothing left for them but what was to be got by opposition to the laws of the Union, which was hateful to them, end quote. The ingenue is the beautiful Ella Beaufort, orphaned at 16 and married to Ferdinand Lefroy at 17. When she tries to refuse to accompany the Lefroy brothers, quote, into Mexico with the view of pushing their fortune there with certain desperados, violence was used to force her, end quote. Enter her knight in shining armor, quote, the Reverend Mr. Peacock, the vice president of the College of St. Louis, upon whose feelings the singular beauty and dignified demeanor of the woman, no doubt, had had much effect. End quote. The wicked brothers are forced to leave without Ella, and for 2 years, Mr. Peacock provides for her. Quote, "It may be understood that in this way an intimacy was created, but it must not be understood that the intimacy was of such a nature as to be injurious to the fair fame of the lady." End quote. Hearing rumors of the husband's death, Mr. Peacock travels to the Mexican border and locates Robert, who provides assurances that Ferdinand Lefroy is dead. Mr. Peacock returns to St. Louis and marries Ella. They have had 6 months together before Ferdinand reappears, very inebriated, but very much alive. Quote, "The woman was a bigamist," accuses Ferdinand, and disappears once again. There's a hint that money might have been given to him. No one knows who, maybe Ella. Although bigamy is still a crime today, we hear very little about it, divorce being much more available than in 1870. Because Ella and Mr. Peacock believed her husband was dead, they are not guilty of a crime, but their marriage is null and void. Since many people in St. Louis saw Ferdinand, they cannot stay there as a married couple, and Mr. Peacock would certainly not be able to keep his position with the college if he continued to live with the woman he deeply loves and feels responsible for. They return to Oxford, pretending to be man and wife, and accept the position at Bowick School, pretending to be man and wife. Mr. Peacock's energy and scholarship soon endear him to the students and their parents, but especially to Dr. Wortle. Quote, "Mr. Peacock had some power about him which was potent over the doctor's spirit." End quote. Mrs. Peacock was tall, dark, and very beautiful. Everyone who met her noted her strength, grace, and ladylike manners. But Dr. Wortle has made enemies, and, quote, "It certainly was said of Mrs. Peacock by some persons that there must have been something in her former life of which she was ashamed." The Honorable Mrs. Stantiloup, to whom all the affairs of Bowick had been of consequence since her husband had lost his lawsuit, and who had not only heard much, but had inquired far and near about Mr. and Mrs. Peacock, declared diligently among her friends, with many nods and winks, that there was something rotten in the state of Denmark. She hints that Dr. Wortle had become enslaved by the lady's beauty. But most people considered this unlikely because, quote, "the doctor, as we have said before, was over 50 years of age." End quote. The mystery was first suggested to Mrs. Stantiloup by the strange refusal of the Peacocks to participate in the social visiting rituals of the community, then added to by the missing 5 years. She asked her many friends, quote, "Don't you think it well you should know something of his life during these 5 years?" End quote. Then the bishop asks the same of Dr. Wortle. Dr. Wortle promises to put the question to Mr. Peacock, although Dr. Wortle felt that, quote, "it was 10,000 pities that a man should be disturbed by unnecessary questionings, who could not only teach and preach, but play cricket also." End quote. But ask the question he does, and Mr. Peacock admits there is a secret. He says, "I will take a week to think of it, and then I will let you know whether I will tell it or whether I will not." Mr. Peacock walks the long way home, and his self-talk reveals many intimate details of his feelings for Ella, and the path that they have chosen. Quote, she had felt herself more at liberty to proclaim to herself a gospel of her own for the guidance of her own soul. To herself, she had never seemed to be vicious or impure, but she understood well that he was not equally free from the bonds which religion had imposed upon him. End quote. Chapter 5 is titled, Then We Must Go, and begins with a wonderful conversation between them as they arrive at this conclusion. But before the tale can be told to Dr. Wortle, there shows up, quote, a very rummy-looking fellow with a beard loose, flowing on both sides as though he were winged like a bird, wearing a coat with frogged buttons that must have been intended to have a military air when it was new, but which was now much the worse for wear, and a hat old and seedy. End quote. No, not the abusive husband, but his brother, Robert, come to blackmail the Peacocks. If this box were full of gold, said the schoolmaster, laying his hand upon a black desk which stood upon the table, I would not give you 1 cent to induce you to hold your tongue forever. I would not condescend even to ask it of you as a favor. End quote. Mr. Peacock then carries on through the day with his teaching duties, but his pupil and friend, Lord Carstairs, notices something is wrong. And please excuse my attempt at Latin pronunciation. Quote, Nil consciere sibi, nulla pellicere culpa, says Mr. Peacock. Mr. Peacock's source is Horace, and the quotation can be translated as, quote, to be guilty, to be conscious of no guilt, to turn pale at no blame. Mr. Peacock uses Horace to express his ethical standard of being right with himself. Trollope quotes the same bit of Horace in chapter 43 of the Claverings and chapter 62 of the Last Chronicle of Barset. My source for this here is a resource, great resource, called Trollope's Apollo, Guides to the Uses of Classics in the Novels of Anthony Trollope. It's really helpful. Both Ella and Mr. Peacock believe they are blameless. They do not feel guilt. As they discuss their situation in chapter 9, he tells her, quote, but it is as the doctor said himself just now. A man cannot isolate the morals, the manners, the ways of his life from the morals of others. Men, if they live together, must live together by certain laws. End quote. Again, they conclude they must go. But Dr. Wortle is not so sure. Quote, and even when he counseled himself to yield to his conscience, his very conscience, a second conscience, as it were, revolted against the first. End quote. He goes for a long horseback ride and worries the issue first this way and that. He consults his wife. And though she has always deferred to his opinions in the past, on this issue, she was decided that they must go. He consults Mr. Puddicombe, the vicar of the next parish, a clergyman without flaw. And this flawless clergyman sees no dilemma. Certainly, I would send him away, he says. As part of his ponderings, Dr. Wortle seizes on an impression that he got from Robert Lefroy that Ferdinand is finally now dead. When directly questioned, Robert denies this, but based on this hopeful hint, Dr. Wortle devises a scheme that, if successful, would solve all their problems. Mr. Peacock must leave immediately for America to find evidence one way or another, and Robert is offered £1,000 to accompany and guide him. Dr. Wortle funds this payment himself. Who is to say what is evidence and what is not? Asked the man, not unnaturally. Mr. Peacock must be the judge, said the doctor. I ain't going to agree to that, said the other. Though he were to see him dead, he might swear he hadn't and not give me a red cent. Why ain't I to be judge as well as he? Because you can trust him, and he cannot in the least trust you, said the doctor. You know well enough that if he were to see your brother alive or to see him dead, you would get the money. That's a whole paragraph there, straight out of Trollope. Now, Mr. Peacock, separating from the woman who is not his wife and going on a quest to prove her legal husband dead, is all very noble and romantic, and possibly even respectable. But the bigamous, adulterous Ella continuing to reside in Dr. Wortle's house is most scandalous. Quote, I should have thought, said Mr. Peacock very slowly, that her presence would have been worse almost than my own. And he is right. In the eyes of the diocese, the woman was, of course, the chief sinner, and the chief sinner was allowed to remain at the school. The bishop is aghast. Would not a lodging here in the city have suited her better, he asks. The fact that wrongdoing in women is scorned helps to maintain the innocence of women. Is it not so? End of quote. But poor Mrs. Wortle, she thinks, quote, anything wrong about a man was but of little moment, comparatively so, even though he were a clergyman. But anything wrong about a woman, oh, she's so near to herself, oh dear, and the poor dear boy's under the same roof with her, end quote. And her husband expects her to visit this pariah, formerly known as Mrs. Peacock. In chapter 12, the Honorable Mrs. Stantiloup takes center stage. At a little house party in Buttercup Hall, the home of Squire Mommsen and family, she launches her campaign to put an end to Dr. Wortle's school. Here she has a captive audience of the three women who are, quote, most likely to be hard upon our doctor. What is Latin and Greek compared to his soul? Asked Lady Margaret, referring to Mrs. Mommsen's son. Mommsen. Mrs. Stantiloup says, quote, if we are not to put down this kind of thing, what is the good of having any morals in the country at all? We might just as well live like pagans and do without any marriage services, as they do in so many parts of the United States, end quote. She continues the battle with letters full of lies, or figures of speech, as our narrator calls them, and she succeeds in convincing many of the most prominent parents to pull their sons out of Dr. Wortle's school. And so we come to the end of Volume 1. I haven't mentioned young Lord Carstairs' feelings for Mary, but we haven't seen enough of either of them to give us much to talk about. When they do make more appearances in the story, consider if and how their story provides a parallel to the main love story. Mr. Peacock is a very romantic figure, and now he is off to America on a do or die, dead or alive mission. He is described as, quote, a small, wiry man, anything but robust in appearance, but still capable of great bodily exertion. He was a great walker. He was a constant reader and could pass from one kind of mental work to another without fatigue, end quote. I couldn't help but try and imagine the actor that would play Mr. Peacock on his Western, for the movie of his Western adventure. Do you have somebody in mind? British, of course. Dr. Wortle's motivations are complex. Why is he taking such a strong stance? Is his attempt to run a good school bound to be at odds with his position as vicar? Does his position as an ordained clergyman in the Church of England compel him to condemn the peacocks? The entire saga swirls around the beautiful, enigmatic, and the still very mysterious Ella Beaufort Lefroy Peacock. She is blamed by everyone except Mr. Peacock and Dr. Wortle for the whole mess, as Mrs. Stantiloup calls it. Did Ella make any wrong choices? Should she feel the shame that she does not? So some questions to think about. Thank you.